And you can't, that never will pass muster under the First Amendment. So is there some way to deal with pornography that in fact degrades women, treats them as sexual objects, subordinates women, and causes various problems, including workplace discrimination, domestic abuse, even rape in some instances? Is there some way to deal with that consistent with the First Amendment? Or do we just give up and say, well, that's one of the things we have to live with? Throw in the towel. Nothing we can do about it. The Constitution stands in our way. Somebody, one of the justices of the court, back talking about national security matters, said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. You know, there have to be ways to deal with some of these problems. And Juliet has one.
I don't think this is like a porn industry issue, it's more of a society issue. You're not going to tell me that someone suddenly watches porn where women were subjected to this, and they all of a sudden change their thought process about women, how they were going to treat them. This simply reflects, porn reflects how maybe people think of women in society. So, you know, it's not really necessarily porn that is the issue, it's our own issue.
You're not suggesting that pornography has no effect on social behavior?
It might perpetuate in terms of like keep reinforcing our standing, so it's not changing and making it better. But I don't think it is simply all of a sudden, you know, before porn, women were still like being objectified. You know, it wasn't this new thing that all of a sudden porn came into play. Oh my God, women are now, you know, inferior and second-class citizens. No, we were treated like that beforehand.
Well, not in readily available media. I don't know what you're thinking of as before porn, the era before porn. How long ago was that? I mean, I remember as a kid, porn consisted of two things. The little comic booklets where you flip through the things, the drawings, the cartoon drawings, and they would do some sexual something, these little flip books or whatever they're called, and European, usually French, grainy, black and white films that ninth grade boys would get together when the parents were out of town and somehow get a copy of this stuff. That was porn in my day. When you say before porn, you think like before Hustler? Or?
More like readily available in terms of like, you know, instant.
Yeah. I think that most of what we think of as porn these days is viewed on computers in the privacy of one's home. I mean, before computers, you'd go to a dirty movie house. Now you can do it in the privacy of your home. But I don't think anybody can deny that sexually charged images pervade our society. We see it in mainstream advertising, Super Bowl ads and stuff. And a lot of it objectifies women and so on. And you just give up on that because that's who we are. That's our society. There's nothing the law can do. I mean, usually the remedy in our society is there ought to be a law. Okay?
That's what I think as well. I think what you're getting at is the issue, which is that it is problem with society. It is problem with society, but I think we think too quickly that we need some tyrannical figure, aka the Supreme Court, to give us the whole law and say like, okay, this is how we behave, this is how we can't behave. And then there's a lot of drawbacks to that. And then we're discussing. It was like I was looking at this like it's kind of a roundabout way of creating a category of speech that kind of like we looked at in the Crush Video's case, which is that they're not saying explicitly like giving us a category. They're saying this is what we can't talk about. And that kind of opens the door like, in a roundabout way for Congress to start creating laws for us for what we can't talk about. I think we should think about it a different way. Like, maybe it's all about more speech. Like have more people talk about what it is, how it women well, and what values are for looking at women non-objectively, not looking at them as sex objects. Rather than saying you can't talk about this, you're saying here's what you should talk about, and this is why. And at least that like because like.
How can government make us talk about that? About accentuate the positive rather than dwell in the squalor of pornography? I mean, you put your finger on one of the great principles of the First Amendment, which is the remedy for bad speech is not suppression, it's more speech. But are the evils of pornography the kind of speech that more speech will cure? Hard to see what government can do to counteract the scourge of pornography. Lindsay?
I think that I kind of agree with the two points. I think that if the issue lies in like the fiction of subordination and like explicit like injuring of women through sexual acts or whatever, I think that it's kind of a self-regulation that has to be put on the porn industry. It's not something that the government can inflict. I think that comes about with social change, and I think that it's more up to the society to like rally together to promote that social change in order to promote that.
Yeah, the porn industry is not very regulated, certainly self-regulated. I mean, they try to stay clear of obscenity prosecutions, and there are, in fact, relatively few of those. But basically, they will push the envelope as far as it can be pushed as long as it generates revenue. Olivia?
So, with this report, does it take consideration, like, research that was done about the correlation between people who watch porn and, like, maybe the negative behavior that results from it, like the correlation between people who watch porn and people who maybe turn and act violent against women because on the basis of what they see, are they reenacting what they see in the videos? But they take that into consideration? I know there's been a lot of research on how men or how people who watch porn tend to view reality in the way that they see it portrayed or depicted in films.
Yeah, there has been research.
Also, wouldn't that start like a concern, like a social concern, that like something that's like, something that's starts to become more widespread, something that's more prominent, something that is of concern to like, people in this country?
If it were crystal clear that watching porn causes rape, for example, it would seem like it would be a good idea for government to put some restrictions on porn. And there has been research on that, and it is at best inconclusive. And I think even Attorney General Meese, the Reagan Attorney General, he conducted published a study of pornography, and even that study found that the research was inconclusive, that there was no causal link between watching porn and sexual violence. It's a very hard thing to study, as you can imagine. I mean, how do you get your data? You can interview rapists, and see how they entertain themselves with porn. Some did, some didn't. There's a lot of evidence that men, like Larry Flynn says, most men read Hustler with one hand. And they use porn as a release, as a masturbatory tool, and get release that way, rather than looking at the pictures and then running out and finding the nearest woman to rape. They don't act out on that. It's simply a fantasy with the idealists. So,
The original question was, if being on hustle, we can still have pornography, still get a part of the issue, which is violence against women, or sorry, guilty in our society. So I mean, has it our society and also comment the next aspect on that? You pass certain laws that would reflect certain protections for women, but as lots of women that people pay, etc. Stuff that happens in work, never stop that.
yeah, it's real easy. I mean, it's not easy to police necessarily, but it's easy to pass a law that is clearly constitutional that requires equal pay for equal work. That deals with one of the supposed consequences of pornography, but it deals with it head on.
But the central issue in this case and in general that it's the treatment of women. It's not that. It's not pornography. It's treatment of women in general. So there have been remedies for that. Not that they may be effective 100%, but they have acted on that. It's up to people to sue on that and act on the statutes to have justice served. So.
Well, let's leave pornography for a moment and deal with a different kind of injurious speech, that is violent video games. And this is a subject on which I have virtually no firsthand experience. I once, a few times, played Tetris back when it was new. But I read in the paper that 80% of high school boys play violent video games regularly and average 10 hours a week of playing violent video games. So let me ask you guys in particular, how many of you have played violent video games? Not very many. What's the current favorite anyway? Yeah. Grand Theft Auto? Have you played Grand Theft Auto? And do you think that playing it had any effect on any physiological or psychological effect on you? No. No? Was it fun?
It was fun. I played it, but I also didn't enjoy it because people play it, so I was like,
To watch? Oh, it's fun to watch other people play?
as well as playing myself.
Does playing it get your heart beat up?
I mean, if you're like really into it. That's the part that's like pretty much.
Yeah. Nick?
I think that violent gaming is different because the target audience is, I know that they say that a lot of time they become way younger and they're still very impressionable when playing the game. It's hard to disconnect video games from reality. You get the Atlantas and the Aurora. I mean, it's hard to separate when you're 14 years old and you're just going out and doing things all the time. It's hard to disconnect that from reality for some people.
It's hard to disconnect it from what they're doing in the game from what they're doing in the real world?
I feel like there's definitely got some evidence in that sense.
There's got to be some effect, you think? Yeah. Go on. Does it give you pause that the shooters in Aurora, in Newtown, in the Columbine thing, were all serious gamers?
Yeah, I would imagine in a world where video games exist, those kinds of people would still find some sort of outlet to engage with their violent things. Like maybe they collect a bunch of gun magazines or something like that. Just because video games is one factor, I don't know that is in most cases playing like that.
Louis?
Those shooters, they have much more famous for circumstances unless video games, I don't think they're playing to this attitude of that. I think people are at an ease of playing video games because they aren't people violent. You know what I mean? People don't look at the really famous game on me. Really don't say anything. Like they don't feel that bad.
Surely there are other factors that play into that kind of behavior, Dasha? Some kind of sublimation. They get the release of their violent instincts is satisfied by the game rather than the real world. So video games are a good outlet, and they should not be required by government as reducing violence in our society. Every public school system should have a required component on immersing the students in violent video games. But when they first got out of the arcade, it was exactly 20 years ago, right about the time most of you were born, that video games, you had to go to the arcade to play them. Now they were available for use in the home. And Mortal Kombat was the first one out. It was a particularly bloody game when it first came out. You could have two levels of violence, violent or really violent. Both versions gave the victor a fatality move, a much cherished chance to kill. The gorier program had the thrill of humiliating the loser by barehandedly ripping out his still beating heart, or tearing off his head and triumphantly holding it aloft. One 16-year-old said, "It's the best. His favorite moves were punching an enemy off a ledge and watching him become impaled on a sharpened spike. And the most gratifying moment was when he could electrocute his opponent." People in California finally had enough, I guess, of violent video games, and the California legislature decided to pass a law dealing with violent video games. And the law defined a violent video game as one in which the options included killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being, if three factors were met. And the three factors should sound familiar to you. One, a reasonable person would find the game appeals to a deviant or morbid interest of minors. Sounds a little bit like appeals to the prurient interest. But in this case, it's a deviant or morbid interest of minors. Secondly, it has to be patently offensive to community standards for minors. And third, the game has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. A kind of a parody of the Miller obscenity test and applying it to violent video games. And calling up our memory about what obscenity is all about. During the argument in the Supreme Court in the video games case, Justice Kennedy asked the lawyer for the video game industry, why shouldn't violence be treated the same as obscenity? How do you answer that? Is there a principled answer to that? We outlaw obscenity categorically. Shouldn't we outlaw depictions of violence categorically? Say this is an unprotected category of speech. No answer for it. Give up. Sorry, we lose. The law is constitutional. Well, Nicole? Mm-hmm. Well, one of the differences between the prohibition of violent video games and the prohibition of obscenity is that the rationale for outlawing the violent video games is not offensiveness, as it is with obscenity, it's actual harm. That playing these games causes harm, either to people injured by the gamer, who gets too violent, aggressive, or the gamer himself, whose brain is twisted by all of this violence that he ingests every day. And California, when is defending the violent video games law, said that they put right in the legislation that this law serves two purposes. It prevents violent, aggressive, and antisocial behavior by the gamer, causing injury to other people. And second, it prevents psychological harm to the minors who play the game. The law, of course, only prohibited sale of the games to minors. It didn't outlaw the games for everyone, for adults, just prohibited sales to minors. Well, during the litigation, the state was pressed on what evidence it had that playing games actually caused violence. And the state gave up. The state said, we don't have any convincing evidence of that. I mean, there's some anecdotal evidence, but nothing that shows a causal link between playing the games and actual violence. I just saw an article recently, a fairly new study, I think it was of college students, in which they had the one group watch or play violent video games and another one didn't. And what they would do is administer hot sauce, real hot sauce, that the victims didn't like hot sauce at all, and they could be dosed by one control group or the other. And the game players who played violent video games gave the victims bigger doses of the hot sauce than the ones who didn't play the violent video games. And there's studies to that effect that there are at least short-term aggressive type feelings as a result of playing the game. But the state of California admitted in court that it could not establish a causal link between playing games and actual violence, so it was left to defend the law on the ground that playing the games hurt the kids, the players themselves, had deleterious psychological effects on the game players themselves. Well, the court handed down its decision in an opinion by Justice Antonin Scalia, June 2011, and there are several interesting points about the court's decision. The first is that video games are speech. That might not be obvious to everyone, but video games are speech. They qualify for First Amendment protection. James Madison might have been surprised to learn that video games would be treated as speech protected by the First Amendment. Not political, it's simply popular entertainment. And Scalia points out that video games are really no different from fiction or plays or movies. They all communicate ideas using character, dialogue, and plot. And Scalia concludes that it is difficult to distinguish entertainment from politics and dangerous to try. So video games are speech. And then the state argued that violent video games are a category of speech that has so little social value and so much potential for social harm that it can be outlawed categorically. It's a category of unprotected speech like obscenity, libel, fighting words, and so on. And here's where the common law method came into the court's decision-making process. It pointed to the precedent, a recent precedent, in the Stevens case, the animal cruelty case, where the court rejected any notion of creating new categories of unprotected speech. Stare decisis requires us to follow the Stevens holding. And we're not going to get into